Have you ever thought of taking photos with those lovely creamy background blur, but just couldn't capture those effects that you wish for? And be confused with all those numbers stated on your camera screen? In this video, I'll highlight the 4 main terminologies that we photographers usually use and to help you understand the basics of aperture better in order to capture that creamy background blur which you've always dreamed of. As this video is the first of the 2-part series on camera aperture, be sure to stay to the end as I'll be giving you a bonus fact on aperture and what's in store for the upcoming second part of the aperture series. Coming up next. Hey, what's up everyone? Maximilian here from MW Photography. Image-based works have been my long-time passion and photography is one of them. In this channel, I hope that you can join me as we embark this journey to explore the wonders of photography, to capturing life's precious moments, and to creating art. So if you're new here, consider subscribing and click on the notification bell icon below to be notified on future videos. With that said, let's get into it. When you're starting out in photography, it's important to know how a camera actually works. You might be confused and even frightened with all the buttons and menu options on your camera at first. But fear not, as I'll go through the main camera features one at a time to help you understand them better. Understanding how to expose an image properly is of utmost importance as it can either break or make a proper photo. So getting the right aperture for the different situation we're in is ever so important. The word aperture originated from the Latin word apertura, which means opening. In terms of photography, it literally means an opening through the lens through which light passes. Now, a camera is divided into 2 main parts, the camera body and the lens. Camera lenses contain openings that are controlled by what's known as aperture blades or diaphragmatic blades. The number of blades differ from lenses to lenses. These blades form and control the opening in the lens which allows light into the lens to reach the sensor. The sensor lies inside the body of the camera behind the lens. Camera aperture acts like the pupils in our eyes, where a dilated pupil allows more light in and a constricted pupil allows less light in. Applying the same principle to photography, a bigger open-up camera aperture allows more light to pass through the lens, while a smaller aperture allows less light to pass through. The aperture controls mainly, first, the light entering the lens and reaching your camera sensor, hence playing a huge role in the exposure or brightness of the final image. The second, the amount of blurring or out of focus in the background or foreground. The third, the amount of in focus from the background to the distant subject. So how does this translate to your camera settings? If you have a camera in hand, you have it switch it on now and set it to aperture priority mode or aperture value or AV mode if you're using a Canon camera. As we go along, do try along the camera settings that I'll be mentioning later in the video. Time for some hands-on experience. There are a few terminologies for aperture that we need to remember. First is the f-stops or f numbers. In the camera, you will notice a letter F followed by a number. It's the f number or the f-stop that's often mentioned by photographers. It may appear as f4.0 or f/4.0. Actually, it means the same thing. So why is it written so as f4.0, f4.5 and so on? Simply speaking, you can take it as a fraction, f4.0 as quarter, f2 as half and so on. It's actually a fraction of the focal length. So to calculate the size of your aperture at a certain f-stop, you have to divide the focal length by the fraction. By putting this in fractions, let me explain the concept by illustrating it using a cup of water. If we compare a half-filled cup of water to a quarter-filled cup of water, which has more or larger in amount of size, it's a half cup of water. Likewise, an aperture of 1/2 or f2 is a larger or greater opening of the lens than 1/4 or f4, and smaller or narrower opening in the lens if we compare f4 to f2. Next, what does the letter F stands for? The letter F in the camera aperture actually means focal length. It is the ratio of the lens focal length to the diameter of the entrance pupil. It basically shows you the change of the aperture size. S stands for a fraction of the focal length. So to calculate the size of your aperture at a certain f-stop, you have to divide the focal length by the fraction. As mentioned earlier in the video, aperture is made out of diaphragmatic blades. As we increase the f number, we are actually closing down the diaphragmatic blades. Just say that our focal length is at 40mm and we set an aperture of 4.0. That means 40mm divided by 4.0, the diameter between the diaphragmatic blades will be 10 mm across. And say the focal length remains at 40mm while the f number is set to f10. By dividing 40 by 10, the distance between the diaphragmatic blades will be 4 mm. So as you can see here, that as we increase the number of the aperture, the smaller or closer the diaphragmatic blades get together, hence constricting that pupil or aperture and limiting the light entering the lens and reaching the camera sensor. Whereas if we reduce the number of aperture, the larger or wider the diaphragmatic blades distance from each other, hence dilating that pupil or aperture and allowing more light to enter the lens and reaching the camera sensor. Next, let's talk about increase and decreasing stops. The f number in our cameras come as a range of numbers or aperture scales, with lenses able to open as wide as f0.7 and down to f32. Remember the f-stop which we mentioned in the first terminology? It's called as f-stop as closing the aperture limits or stops the light from entering the lens. A stop in general is a doubling or halving of the amount of light let in when taking a photo. So if you increase the stop, then you're increasing the amount of light coming in by double. And if you decrease the stop, then you're cutting the amount of light coming in by half. In terms of aperture f numbers, you need to multiply or divide the f number by 1.41, which is the square root of 2, to get the ideal aperture. For example, going from f2.8 to f4 is a decrease of 1 stop, because 4 equals to 2.8 times 1.41. Changing from f16 to f11 is an increase of 1 stop, because 11 equals to 16 divided by 1.41. Third terminology is the depth of field. Depth of field, or DOF, is the amount of your photograph that appears sharp from front to back. The terms greater or huge or larger or shallow depth of field are usually used. So question is, how exactly does depth of field works? Let's illustrate the depth of field using a sheet of paper. So anything that's in line with the paper remains in focus. When your aperture becomes smaller or the number gets bigger, the paper becomes thicker and thicker, and anything that's within the thickness of the paper come into focus. Whereas when your aperture becomes larger, that means your number becomes smaller, the paper becomes thinner again, and anything that's in line with the paper remains in focus, while those areas outside of the line become blurry. So in this context, the smaller the aperture, the greater the depth of field. The larger the aperture, the shallower the depth of field. So greater depth of field means the more in focus your subject will be, while shallow depth of field means the more out of focus your subject will be. In more simple terms of understanding, the larger the aperture, the larger the amount of blur in the foreground and background from the subject, while the smaller the aperture, the smaller the amount of blur in the background and foreground from the subject. Let me now show you some examples. So here we have a photo which is captured at f1.4. So f1.4 is considered to be a large aperture with a smaller number and producing a shallower depth of field with a greater blur. So as we can see in this picture, the soft toy here is in focus, as this soft toy is in the same plane or same row to this soft toy. It is also in focus, whereas those in the foreground and the background are all out of focus. So this area is the depth of field for this picture at f1.4. Whereas this area, since it's out of the focus depth of field, it becomes blur. So now as we go along, this was captured at f2.0. You may not realize how much the depth of field actually changed. So as we increase the f number to 2.8, 4.0, 5.6, 8, 11, 16, and 22, we can now see that this aperture is considered to be a small aperture with a large number giving a wide depth of field, hence giving a less blurry picture. So earlier on at f1.4, this soft toy and this soft toy is in focus, whereas at f22 we can see that now the foreground objects are in focus, including the table, and those in the background also come into focus. Hence we code all these areas the current depth of field for f22, which is considered wide. Larger apertures or smaller numbers are generally used in portraiture works where you want to capture and bring the viewer's eyes and focus on the subject, while smaller apertures or higher numbers are generally used in landscape photography works where you want the entire photo to be in focus until the horizon in the photo. The fourth terminology for aperture is wide open or fast lenses and closed down or slow lenses. When photographers say lens at wide open, we're actually referring to the maximum diameter that the aperture blades can open for that specific lens. Lens manufacturers usually place the widest aperture f number on the lens. For example, this Canon lens has a widest aperture at 1.8. Some lenses' maximum aperture may be at 3.5 or f5.6, which means lesser light is allowed to enter the lens. A wide open lens is considered to be a fast lens as you do not need to make much compensation in the camera settings to compensate the light that you lost. While a lens with a smaller maximum aperture is considered as a slower lens as you need to make more adjustments in your camera settings to compensate the loss of light entering the lens. Bear in mind, however, that there's also a limit to lenses where there's a point that the aperture blades could no longer come close together. And this is when we usually say, close down the aperture to this or that number. I will talk more about the adjustment compensation and how it relates to the fast and slow lenses mentioned here in my later videos. You mainly need to remember the wide open and close down concepts for now. So why bother about how wide a lens's aperture can get? First, as mentioned earlier, the larger the aperture, meaning the smaller the f number, the more light enters the lens, the shallower the depth of field and the greater amount of blur in the background and foreground from the subject. You can now obtain those creamy blurry background photos which you have always wanted. Second, since having a wide aperture means allowing more light to pass through, a wide aperture allows us to shoot better photos in low light situations as more light can pass through the lens and reach the camera sensor, hence obtaining a cleaner image with natural light without using the camera's own inbuilt light sensitivity function. By the way, what's the physics behind the camera aperture producing a blur background and bringing an image into focus? I'll do my best to explain it in simpler terms in my future videos, so stay tuned. Bonus fact of the day. Have you heard or said the word bokeh before? How do you usually pronounce it? Bokeh, bokeh, or... Well, it actually came from a Japanese word known as bokeh. Bokeh, not boka or some other pronunciation. I'm no different, I've pronounced it as boka years back. Leave a comment below if you have pronounced it otherwise previously. So take home message. Aperture consists of blades in the lens that can open up and come close together and plays a huge role in allowing light to enter the lens. The smaller the f number, the larger the aperture, allowing more light to enter through the lens. The larger the f number, the smaller the aperture, restricting the light entering the lens. A f-stop in general is a doubling or halving of the amount of light let in when taking a photo. However, it may be a little different in terms of aperture as mentioned earlier. Smaller aperture produce smaller amount of foreground and background blur, producing a wide depth of field, while larger aperture produce larger amount of foreground and background blur, producing a shallow depth of field. Aperture is a crucial, if not the most important, amongst the camera settings that needs to be adjusted prior adjusting other camera settings. Aperture may be confusing at first with all the photographic terminologies and concepts, and you may need to take hundreds, if not thousands of photos before these concepts become more understandable. Nevertheless, practice makes perfect. Do take your time to understand the concepts of aperture as we dive even deeper into understanding aperture in the next video, where I'll talk about the good and bad effects that aperture can actually bring to the photo. I've also put timestamps in the description below for your references to return to the important segments highlighted in this video. I hope this video will give you a better understanding on camera aperture. So grab your camera and start practicing to capture those beautiful creamy bokeh that you've always wanted. If you find this video helpful, do give it a like and click on the subscribe button down below for more content such as this. I'm Maximilian Wong. Feel free to check out my other videos in the channel for better understanding on photography. And also drop by my social media, links in the description down below. Till then, take care and stay safe, and I'll see you in the next one.